The December fog that enveloped London that evening seemed particularly oppressive when the desperate telegram arrived at Baker Street from Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a young social reformer whose charitable work had taken her to St. Margaret's Orphanage on Grimsby Road in the East End. The message was brief, but conveyed genuine terror. Children were disappearing from the orphanage, 5 in the past 3 months, and the authorities dismissed her concerns as runaways, despite evidence suggesting something far more sinister. She begged Holmes to investigate before more children vanished into the darkness that seemed to pervade that grim establishment. Before I continue with this remarkable case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support allows us to keep bringing these mysteries to you. Now, let us proceed. Within 2 hours, despite the lateness of the hour and the thickness of the fog, Holmes and I found ourselves in one of London's most wretched neighborhoods, where narrow streets twisted between decaying buildings, and the air itself seemed heavy with poverty and despair. St. Margaret's Orphanage occupied a large Victorian brick building that might once have been a warehouse or factory, its windows barred, its entrance forbidding, its very architecture seeming designed more for confinement than care. Miss Eleanor Hartwell met us at the entrance, a young woman of perhaps 28 years, whose fine features and cultured manner spoke of privileged origins, yet whose clothing was practical, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who performed actual physical labor rather than merely directing charitable activities from a comfortable distance. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and worry, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank heaven you've come. I feared you might dismiss my concerns, as the police have done, as even the orphanage board has done. But I know something terrible is happening to these children, and if we do not act quickly, more will disappear." Her voice trembled with barely controlled emotion as she led us through dimly lit corridors that echoed with the distant sounds of children's voices, some laughing, some crying, all sounding somehow hollow in the institutional emptiness. We were shown to a small office that Miss Hartwell had commandeered for her investigation, a cramped room filled with papers, records, and detailed notes she had compiled during her months of volunteer work at St. Margaret's. Holmes immediately began examining these documents with his characteristic methodical intensity, while I attempted to understand the broader context of the situation. "Tell us everything," Holmes commanded, without looking up from the records. "Begin with the first disappearance. Give me precise dates, names, circumstances, and every detail you observed, however insignificant it may seem." Miss Hartwell took a deep breath and began her account. "The first child to disappear was Thomas Whitmore, age 9, 3 months ago. He was a clever boy, good with his hands, learning a trade from one of our visiting craftsmen. He vanished one night between bed check and morning inspection. The matron, Mrs. Blackwood, claimed he had run away, as children sometimes do. The police made perfunctory inquiries but ultimately accepted the runaway explanation." "Was there any evidence he planned to run away? Had he expressed such intentions? Did he take any possessions with him?" "None whatsoever. That's what troubled me from the start. Thomas had no possessions to speak of. What orphan does? His few clothes were found neatly folded in his dormitory locker. He left behind a small wooden carving he had been working on for weeks. something he treasured. It made no sense that he would abandon it if he were running away voluntarily. Continue with the other disappearances. Over the next hour, Miss Hartwell detailed 4 more vanishings, each following a similar, disturbing pattern. Sarah Mitchell, age 7, had disappeared 6 weeks after Thomas. Then James Pemberton, age 11. Then 2 sisters, Mary and Alice Thornton, ages 10 and 8, who had vanished on the same night just 2 weeks previously. In each case, the children had left behind their few possessions, had given no indication of planning to leave, and had seemingly vanished from locked dormitories in the dead of night without raising any alarm. "The dormitories are locked from the outside?" Holmes asked sharply, his gray eyes suddenly intense. "Yes, a security measure supposedly to keep the children safe, but it also means they cannot leave without a key, which only the staff possess. Yet somehow these children disappeared from rooms that were supposedly secure, leaving no trace of how they got out." Holmes rose and began pacing the small office, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "Miss Hartwell, tell me about the staff of this institution. Who runs St. Margaret's? Who has unrestricted access to the dormitories? And most importantly, who has the most to gain from these disappearances?" "The orphanage is overseen by Mr. Edmund Blackwood, who serves as director and chief administrator. His wife, Mrs. Margaret Blackwood, serves as matron, responsible for the children's day-to-day care. They have 3 assistants, Mr. Thomas Grimsby, who manages supplies and maintenance, Miss Caroline Hartwell, no relation to me, who teaches the children basic lessons, and Mr. James Thornton, who serves as night watchman and security guard." "And the orphanage's finances? How is it supported?" "Through charitable donations primarily, though there is also a government subsidy based on the number of children in residence. The more children St. Margaret's houses, the more funding it receives. Which is why—" Miss Hartwell hesitated, clearly troubled by what she was about to suggest. "Go on," Holmes encouraged. "Which is why the official records show no decrease in the number of children despite these disappearances. Mr. Blackwood continues to claim government funding for children who are no longer here. I discovered this only recently while reviewing the financial records. He is committing fraud by reporting disappeared children as still in residence." "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured. "And what happens when government inspectors come to verify the count?" "That's the truly disturbing part, Mr. Holmes. New children arrive shortly before inspections, children transferred from other institutions or taken in from the streets, in numbers that precisely replace those who have disappeared. It's as though the disappearances are timed to maintain a consistent population while avoiding detection." Holmes's examination of St. Margaret's extended through the night and into the following day. He inspected the dormitories where children had vanished, studying the locks, the windows, the floorboards, searching for any evidence of how someone might have removed a sleeping child without being detected. He interviewed the children themselves when opportunities arose, asking carefully constructed questions designed to elicit information without alarming them. He examined the orphanage's physical structure, discovering old architectural plans that revealed the building's original purpose as a textile warehouse with loading docks and underground storage cellars. Most significantly, Holmes insisted on meeting the staff members Miss Hartwell had mentioned. Edmund Blackwood proved to be a corpulent man of perhaps 50 years, with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to soliciting charitable donations and the watchful eyes of someone guarding secrets. His wife Margaret was harder, more suspicious, with the air of someone who viewed the children in her care as problems to be managed rather than souls to be nurtured. Thomas Grimsby, the maintenance man, was a taciturn individual who seemed to know every corner of the old building's structure. Caroline Hartwell, the teacher, appeared genuinely devoted to the children, but intimidated by the Blackwoods. And James Thornton, the night watchman, struck Holmes as particularly interesting. A former soldier who walked with a slight limp and spoke with the clipped precision of military training. "Mr. Thornton," Holmes said during their interview, "you are responsible for security during the night hours when these children disappeared, yet you heard and saw nothing unusual." "Nothing, sir. I make my rounds every hour, checking locks and looking for anything amiss. The dormitories were secure when I checked them. In the morning, the children were simply gone." "Did you check inside the dormitories during your rounds, or merely verify the external locks were secure?" Thornton hesitated fractionally. "I verified the locks, sir. Opening the doors would have disturbed the children's sleep. So someone inside the dormitory could have removed the children, relocked the door from within using a duplicate key, and you would not have known." I suppose that's theoretically possible, though I can't imagine who would have such a key, or how they would exit afterward. Holmes's investigation expanded beyond St. Margaret's itself to the surrounding neighborhood. He questioned local shopkeepers, constables, street vendors, anyone who might have observed unusual activity near the orphanage. What emerged was a pattern of nighttime wagon traffic that seemed excessive for an institution housing children. Several witnesses recalled seeing covered wagons arriving late at night and departing hours before dawn, though no one had thought to question this activity. "Wagons arriving at night, Watson," Holmes explained as we reviewed our findings. "Supposedly delivering supplies, though the volumes seem far larger than an orphanage would require. But consider another possibility. Those wagons are not delivering, but collecting, taking something of value away from St. Margaret's under cover of darkness." "But Holmes, what could they be taking? The children?" "Precisely, Watson, but not randomly. And not for the reasons one might initially suspect. I believe we are dealing with a form of child trafficking, but one more sophisticated than simple kidnapping for labor or exploitation." Over the following days, through a combination of surveillance, informant networks, and painstaking investigation, Holmes uncovered the horrifying truth. The children disappearing from St. Margaret's were being sold to various unscrupulous parties who required child labor for dangerous or illegal work. Thomas Whitmore had been sold to a chimney sweep who employed small children to climb narrow flues. Sarah Mitchell had been sold to a textile factory owner who used children for work in spaces too confined for adults. The Thornton sisters had been taken by a criminal gang that trained children as thieves and pickpockets. But the operation was even more systematic and calculated than simple trafficking. Edmund Blackwood had developed a sophisticated business model that exploited the orphanage system itself. He would take in children from various sources, claim government subsidies for their care, provide minimal actual support while pocketing the majority of the funding, then sell selected children to buyers willing to pay premium prices for workers of specific ages and abilities. The disappeared children would be replaced with new arrivals just before inspections, maintaining the fiction of proper population numbers while generating profit from both government subsidies and illegal sales. "It is a complete perversion of charitable purpose," Holmes said with cold fury. "An institution supposedly devoted to protecting vulnerable children has instead become a marketplace for selling them into various forms of servitude and exploitation. Blackwood has turned human misery into a profitable enterprise." The challenge now was to gather sufficient evidence for prosecution, while simultaneously locating and rescuing the disappeared children before they were moved beyond reach. Holmes orchestrated a complex operation involving Scotland Yard, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and even sympathetic members of Parliament who had been horrified by his preliminary findings. The trap was set with careful precision. Holmes arranged for a supposed buyer to approach Blackwood through criminal intermediaries, someone seeking to purchase a specific type of child for factory work. The transaction was to occur at St. Margaret's itself, with Holmes's fictitious buyer inspecting available children and negotiating prices. In reality, Inspector Lestrade and a substantial force of constables would be positioned throughout the building and surrounding area, ready to arrest everyone involved once the illegal transaction was documented. The operation unfolded on a fog-shrouded evening when visibility was poor and criminal activity less likely to be observed by casual witnesses. Holmes, disguised as a wealthy factory owner from the Midlands, arrived at St. Margaret's, with myself playing the role of his business manager. Blackwood received us in his office, with the practiced cordiality of someone conducting a business transaction he had executed many times before. "Gentlemen, I understand you have specific requirements for workers. St. Margaret's exists to find appropriate placements for our charges, and I'm confident we can accommodate your needs." His language was carefully constructed to sound like legitimate employment placement, but the financial negotiations that followed made clear this was straightforward human trafficking. Blackwood led us to a basement room where a dozen children were assembled, arranged by age and general abilities. The scene was heartbreaking. Frightened children standing in what amounted to a slave market, being evaluated for purchase like livestock. Holmes maintained his disguise while systematically documenting everything that occurred, noting names, prices discussed, and Blackwood's explicit statements about the children's future assignments. At the crucial moment, when money was about to change hands and children were being prepared for transfer, Holmes gave the prearranged signal. Lestrade and his constables burst into the orphanage from multiple entry points simultaneously. Blackwood attempted to flee through an underground passage he had constructed for exactly this contingency. But Holmes had anticipated this possibility and positioned officers at every possible exit. The arrests that followed were extensive. Edmund and Margaret Blackwood were taken into custody along with Thomas Grimsby, who had helped construct the secret passage and facilitated the nighttime wagon transfers. James Thornton, the night watchman, confessed, after minimal interrogation, that he had been paid to ignore unusual activity and falsify his security logs. Even several of the supposed charitable donors to St. Margaret's were eventually revealed to be criminal associates, participating in the trafficking network. Most importantly, Holmes's investigation led to the location and rescue of 4 of the 5 disappeared children. Thomas Whitmore was found with the chimney sweep who had purchased him, malnourished and suffering from respiratory problems, but alive. The Thornton sisters were recovered from the criminal gang before they could be moved to a permanent location. Sarah Mitchell remained missing for several more weeks, until Holmes's continued investigation traced her to a textile mill in Lancashire, where she was finally reunited with Miss Hartwell and placed in legitimate care. The case attracted national attention once the full extent of the scandal became public. Newspapers published detailed accounts of how one of London's supposed charitable institutions had been operating as a front for child trafficking. The revelations prompted a comprehensive investigation of orphanages throughout England, leading to reforms in oversight, inspection procedures, and funding mechanisms designed to prevent similar abuses. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, whose persistence and courage had initiated the investigation, was recognized for her efforts and went on to establish her own genuinely charitable organization dedicated to protecting vulnerable children. She maintained correspondence with Holmes for years afterward, occasionally consulting him on cases where she suspected institutional abuse or exploitation. Several months after the conclusion of the case, Miss Hartwell called at Baker Street to thank Holmes once more and to provide an update on the rescued children. They were now in legitimate care facilities, receiving proper education and support, slowly recovering from their traumatic experiences. Mr. Holmes, I can never adequately express my gratitude for what you accomplished. Those children owe their lives to your investigation. But what troubles me still is knowing how many other institutions might be operating similar schemes. How can we ever be certain children in care are actually being protected rather than exploited? Vigilance, Miss Hartwell, Holmes replied. Constant, unrelenting vigilance by people like yourself, who care enough to look beyond official records and ask difficult questions. Systems of protection only work when individuals refuse to accept convenient explanations and demand truth, regardless of how disturbing it may be. You demonstrated that principle when everyone else, the police, the orphanage board, even other social reformers, dismissed your concerns. That combination of caring and skepticism is humanity's best defense against institutional evil. After Miss Hartwell departed, I reflected with Holmes on the particularly disturbing nature of this case. An orphanage, an institution specifically charged with protecting the most vulnerable, perverted into an instrument of exploitation and trafficking. It represents a profound betrayal of trust. Yet sadly, not an uncommon one, Watson. Wherever society creates institutions with power over vulnerable populations, there exists the potential for that power to be abused. Orphanages, workhouses, hospitals, asylums. All can become sites of exploitation when oversight is inadequate, and those in authority prioritize profit over care. The orphanage on Grimsby Road was particularly egregious, but I fear it was not unique. The case had lasting legal implications as well. Edmund Blackwood and his wife were tried and convicted on multiple charges, including child trafficking, fraud, conspiracy, and various offenses related to child endangerment. They received substantial prison sentences that ensured they would never again have authority over vulnerable children. The trial testimony was so disturbing that it prompted immediate legislative action. New laws establishing more rigorous inspection standards for charitable institutions, mandatory independent oversight of orphanages, and criminal penalties for those who profited from the exploitation of children in care. Holmes himself testified extensively at both the criminal trials and subsequent parliamentary hearings on orphanage reform. His detailed documentation of Blackwood's operation, his chemical analysis of the inadequate and sometimes contaminated food provided to the children, and his systematic exposure of the fraudulent record-keeping provided the foundation for comprehensive institutional reform. This case demonstrated something I have long suspected, Holmes remarked during one of our many discussions about the orphanage investigation. The greatest crimes are often not the dramatic murders or spectacular thefts that capture public imagination, but rather the systematic exploitation of the powerless by those in positions of authority. Blackwood's operation destroyed young lives methodically over years, yet it was almost invisible, because society preferred not to look too closely at what happened to orphaned children. The orphanage building on Grimsby Road itself was eventually closed and sold, with the proceeds directed toward legitimate child welfare organizations. The site carried a stigma for years afterward. Local residents spoke of it as a cursed place, haunted by the suffering of the children who had been exploited there. Eventually, it was demolished and replaced with workers' housing, though the street name remained as an unwitting memorial to one of London's darkest charitable frauds. Holmes kept among his case files a small wooden carving, the treasure that Thomas Whitmore had left behind when he disappeared from his dormitory. Thomas had given it to Holmes after his rescue, as a thank you gift. It was crude, the work of an untrained child, but Holmes valued it as representing something important: the resilience and creativity of children, even in the most oppressive circumstances, and the importance of never dismissing concerns about their welfare simply because investigating those concerns is uncomfortable or inconvenient. Years later, when I finally published an account of the Grimsby Road case, it was serialized in several newspapers and generated renewed public discussion about child welfare and institutional accountability. Several former residents of various orphanages contacted me with their own stories of abuse and exploitation, many of which I passed along to appropriate authorities for investigation. Holmes himself wrote a detailed monograph on methods for detecting institutional fraud and exploitation, which became required reading for government inspectors responsible for monitoring charitable organizations. It outlined specific warning signs, suspicious financial patterns, discrepancies between reported and actual populations, resistance to unannounced inspections, high turnover of staff or residents that could indicate systematic abuse. The case also had personal impact on both Holmes and myself. Holmes became involved with several legitimate child welfare organizations, providing consulting services without fee to help ensure their operations were truly serving children's interests. I volunteered my medical services at a properly run orphanage in South London, wanting to contribute in some small way to healing the systemic failures the Grimsby Road case had exposed. As I completed my notes on this case late one evening, Holmes was reading correspondence from Miss Hartwell about the continuing progress of the rescued children. "Thomas Whitmore is apprenticing as a carpenter," he reported. Sarah Mitchell has shown remarkable aptitude for mathematics despite her limited education. The Thornton sisters are in a foster home together, slowly overcoming their trauma. There is resilience in these young souls, Watson. They survived exploitation and are building new lives. That is perhaps the most hopeful aspect of this entire terrible affair. Yet 5 children would still be suffering, or worse, had Miss Hartwell not persisted in her concerns, I observed. Precisely. Which is why this case, more than many others, affirms my belief in the importance of what we do. Detection is not merely about solving puzzles or catching criminals for their own sake. It is about protecting the vulnerable, exposing injustice, and creating accountability where power would otherwise operate without constraint. The orphanage on Grimsby Road operated for years because no one with authority cared enough to look beyond convenient explanations. Miss Hartwell cared. That caring, combined with systematic investigation, saved lives and reformed an entire system. The orphanage on Grimsby Road remained in my notes as one of the most emotionally affecting cases of Holmes's career. It lacked the dramatic flourishes of some investigations. No impossible locked rooms, no exotic poisons, no international conspiracies. Instead, it revealed a mundane but devastating evil: the systematic exploitation of powerless children by those charged with protecting them, hidden behind the respectable facade of charitable work. And in that revelation lay perhaps the case's deepest lesson: that evil does not always announce itself dramatically, that some of the worst crimes are committed in plain sight by apparently respectable people, and that protecting society's most vulnerable requires not just formal institutions and laws, but also individuals willing to ask difficult questions and refuse to accept comfortable lies. The children of Grimsby Road had been voiceless and powerless, considered by society as unfortunate, but ultimately disposable. Holmes had given them a voice by refusing to dismiss their disappearances as mere runaways. Miss Hartwell had advocated for them when no one else would. Together, they had proven that even the most marginalized and vulnerable deserve protection, investigation, and justice. That principle, Holmes believed, was the foundation of any truly civilized society.